In the imagination of the average person, a medieval castle is something majestic and mysterious, standing above time as a symbol of ancient power. But few people think about how these monumental fortresses, built without modern equipment and technology, actually appeared from the ground. It was not just an act of construction, but a grandiose undertaking requiring enormous resources, labor that is incomprehensible by our standards, and sometimes decades of persistent, dangerous work. Unlike the short-lived projects of today, a castle was an investment for centuries, designed to protect, assert power, and serve as a symbol of immutability. The construction of such structures transformed entire landscapes, created temporary cities for workers, and required incredible coordination. Their lives, their methods, their challenges are not just a history of construction, but a history of the era itself, captured in stone. Watch until the end to find out why the absence of a simple bucket could halt the construction of a castle for months. While the vast majority of workers on castle construction sites toiled away, there was one category of castle servants whose role was completely unexpected and quite unusual for their time. Young guardians of the royal or lordly treasuries and archives. These young pages, or squires, often from noble but less wealthy families, were appointed to this position not only because of their origins, but also for a completely pragmatic reason. Their small size and agility allowed them to sneak into narrow hidden passages and niches inside the castle walls, where the most valuable treasures, documents, and even military supplies were kept. The architecture of many castles, especially the most secure keep, included hidden passages and hiding places invisible to the untrained eye. These spaces were so narrow and winding that an adult could not squeeze through or turn around. It was precisely for access to these spaces that the Golden Boys were used. Their task was not only to deliver or remove valuables, but also to periodically check the safety of the hiding places, clean dust and cobwebs, and ventilate them to prevent the parchments and fabrics from deteriorating due to dampness. Some of these hiding places were so airtight that it took special skill to avoid suffocating inside. Their work was fraught with enormous responsibility and risk. They had access to untold riches and state secrets, which made them potential targets for bribery, kidnapping, or even murder by enemies of the lord or king. Despite their young age, they were required to be completely loyal and maintain the strictest secrecy. Some sources even mention cases where such golden boys were deliberately kept in the castle in relative isolation to minimize their contact with the outside world and prevent information leaks. Their training included not only learning how to navigate the complex network of castle mazes, but also the basics of encryption so that they could understand and transmit coded messages. Can you imagine what it was like to be a child, yet keep the kingdom's most terrible secrets and greatest treasures, knowing that one wrong move or word could cost you your life? This was not a widespread practice, but such cases, although rarely documented due to their secrecy, vividly demonstrate the unconventional approach to security and resource use in the Middle Ages. The very idea that the fate of treasures and state secrets could depend on the dexterity and loyalty of a child is truly astonishing. These young guardians were not just errand boys, but key elements of a security system whose role was vital, yet remained completely invisible to most. Can you imagine being a child entrusted with the kingdom's most terrifying secrets and greatest treasures, knowing that one wrong move could cost you your life? These young guardians were not just errand boys, but key elements of the security system. Unlike the modern standardized world, medieval castle construction faced a unique problem: the lack of a unified system of measurement across England. Although the king sought to establish common standards, in practice, each locality, and sometimes each major feudal lord, could use their own local feet or yards. This not only complicated logistics, but also led to surprising architectural anomalies and required incredible adaptability from master masons. For example, a foot in one county could be longer or shorter than a foot in a neighboring county. Moreover, the master mason himself, who was often a native of a particular area and accustomed to working according to his own standards, could bring his habits to a new construction site. This meant that different parts of the castle, built by different teams or master builders from different regions, could have small but noticeable differences in the size of openings, the width of walls, or the height of floors. In surviving documents, for example, in the description of construction work for Windsor Castle, there are references to the fact that not only different teams were used for different elements of the structure, but also their privileged metrics. Master masons often carried their own reference measuring sticks or rulers, carved from wood or bone, which could differ from royal standards or the measurements of other craftsmen. These tools were their personal code and a guarantee of accuracy, but at the same time a source of these regional variations. In essence, each castle was a kind of unique metrological experiment. The lack of precise drawings in the modern sense, where dimensions were specified by general proportions and relationships rather than strict figures, only exacerbated this situation. The most difficult part was when materials were supplied from different sources, where each quarry or forest could follow its own rules for measurement or shipment. For example, stone blocks ordered from one quarry might not exactly match the dimensions expected from another supplier, requiring additional, time-consuming adjustments on site. This metric anarchy forced the castle builders to be not just builders, but also skilled adapters, able to adjust plans on the fly and compensate for differences in order to ultimately achieve a solid and durable structure. Thus, each castle bore not only the imprint of its era, but also invisible traces of regional languages of measurement, making it unique in the literal sense. Would you trust a fortress built without a single ruler? Write in the comments. What surprised you most about this? Leave your opinion. Thousands of people, from highly skilled masons, blacksmiths, and carpenters to unskilled laborers and diggers, temporarily moved to the castle construction site. In most cases, they did not arrive alone, but with their entire families, bringing with them tents, tools, and everything necessary for life in a new place. Almost instantly, an infrastructure sprang up around the construction site, albeit a primitive one, with houses, sheds, temporary workshops, street fires, and even spontaneous markets. There was an acute need for food, tools, clothing, services, and essential goods. This, in turn, attracted an army of merchants, shoemakers, saddlers, blacksmiths, tailors, brewers, and often representatives of the oldest profession, who followed the places where men with money were concentrated. Although such settlements were formally considered temporary, they existed for years, sometimes decades, and could easily number several hundred and sometimes even thousands of people. Despite their precarious legal status, these camps had their own system of self-government, something between a guild model and military order. All issues were resolved under the control of the lord or his administrator, who appointed overseers responsible for discipline, supplies, and labor accounting. Special laws applied here, which did not always coincide with the statutes of the nearest towns, but were strictly observed within the camp. Trade was often conducted on a barter basis, and sometimes local forms of currency were used, including handwritten tokens, pieces of leather with markings, or even special wooden sticks with notches. One of the least known but critically important elements of this economy was the system of labor duties, a form of feudal taxation in which peasants from nearby villages were obliged to participate in construction as labor suppliers. Thus, during the construction of royal castles such as Harlequins or Caernarfon in Wales, forced recruitment was practiced. Each baron was obliged to provide a certain number of workers, draft animals, or even provisions. People could arrive with tools, carts, oxen, sometimes for several weeks. Such assistance could be considered a feudal duty, and although in some cases peasants were entitled to modest pay or food rations, this often turned out to be a mere formality. Such conditions caused tension and often provoked unrest, especially during periods of crop shortages or prolonged rains. No less interesting was the practice of the pledge economy, which was used in conditions of acute cash shortages. Instead of wages, workers were given special tokens, wooden or bone tablets stamped with the project's mark, which could be exchanged for bread, porridge, ale, or other products from registered suppliers working on the construction site. These tokens often had expiration dates or were only accepted on certain days of the week to prevent hoarding and dishonest exchanges. In effect, it was a closed system that kept workers inside the camp, making them dependent on the construction site and reducing the risk of desertion. Similar systems, found in archaeological layers at some large 13th century construction sites, can be seen as a prototype of a controlled labor economy. But like any large gathering of people, these temporary cities had a downside. The chaotic nature, lack of sanitation, and high population density contributed to outbreaks of disease, especially intestinal diseases. Theft was a constant problem, not only of food and clothing, but also of building materials, which could be sold secretly or used for personal needs. Conflicts over delayed payments, food distribution, or excessive workloads flared up regularly. In addition, the camps often became the target of attacks by small bands of robbers or hostile feudal lords. Both the workers and the supplies were of considerable value. To maintain order, the lords were forced to assign guards, organize night patrols, and appoint people responsible for maintaining internal order. Thus, building a castle was not just a matter of erecting walls and towers, but also a whole social and economic system resembling a miniature state living by its own laws. These dynamic communities could disappear within weeks of the project's completion, leaving behind only burials, pottery shards, and memories in Latin documents. And yet it was these living walls, these temporary camps filled with noise, smoke, hunger, and dreams, that stood behind every stone block that has survived to this day. In the imagination of the average person, a medieval castle is something majestic and mysterious, standing above time as a symbol of ancient power. But few people think about how these monumental fortresses, built without modern equipment and technology, appeared from the ground in the first place. It was not just an act of construction, but a grandiose undertaking requiring enormous resources, labor that is incomprehensible by our standards, and sometimes decades of persistent, dangerous work. Unlike the short-lived projects of today, a castle was an investment in the centuries, designed to protect, assert power, and serve as a symbol of immutability. The construction of such structures transformed entire landscapes, created temporary cities for workers, and required incredible coordination. Their lives, their methods, their challenges are not just a history of construction, but a history of the era itself, captured in stone. In addition to its primary defensive function, the medieval castle was a powerful symbol of the power, wealth, and prestige of its owner. Its size, location, quality of construction, and decorative elements served as an open manifesto of its power and status in the feudal hierarchy. The construction of a large stone castle was a colossal financial investment, available only to kings or the most powerful lords. The cost of construction could be measured in thousands or even tens of thousands of pounds, which at that time was equivalent to billions today. The enormous costs of materials, stone, wood, iron, the wages of thousands of workers and specialists, and logistics made the castle the most expensive project of its time. Therefore, the very existence of a castle spoke of the untold wealth of its owner. The location of the castle also emphasized power. Castles were often built at strategically important points, such as crossroads, river fords, or high hills, from where the entire surrounding area could be seen. This allowed the owners to control the territory, collect taxes, and demonstrate their hegemony. A castle on a hill literally towered over everyone, symbolizing the lord's dominance over his lands and subjects. The architectural and decorative elements of the castle were also designed to impress and intimidate. High towers, massive gates, crenellated walls, battlements, and the owner's coat of arms and symbols carved in stone sent a clear message. This place belongs to a powerful man, and it is impregnable. Some castles, such as Caernarfon Castle in Wales, were built with particular attention to detail, replicating the styles of Roman or legendary fortresses to give them additional symbolic weight and legitimacy. Caernarfon, with its polygonal towers and striped masonry, was meant to be associated with Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire, emphasizing Edward I's imperial ambitions. Moreover, the castle was the center of the lord's administrative and judicial power, a place where justice was administered, taxes were collected, and important documents were kept. Its grandeur was intended to inspire awe and submission. For the common man, the castle was not only a fortress, but also the visible embodiment of the power that determined his life. The heart of any stone castle was undoubtedly stone, and its extraction was one of the most extensive and labor-intensive stages of construction. In England, where castles were built in large numbers after the Norman conquest, the presence of nearby quarries suitable for construction was a key factor that could significantly speed up and reduce the cost of a project. If there were none, the stone had to be transported from many kilometers away, which required huge transportation costs and increased the construction time of the castle significantly. Various types of stone were used: limestone, sandstone, granite, and sometimes local flint for internal masonry or foundation reinforcement. The choice depended on the geological features of the region and the availability of resources. The quality of the stone determined not only the strength but also the appearance of the future fortress. Stonemasons and laborers worked in the quarries. The former, being highly skilled craftsmen, were responsible for accurately cutting the stone and giving it the desired shape and size using chisels, hammers, and pickaxes. Their work required not only physical strength, but also a deep understanding of the properties of stone, its layers and cracks. Stonemasons often left their individual mason's marks on the processed blocks, which served as a kind of signature and helped keep track of the work done. Unskilled workers, in turn, did the heaviest and most dangerous work, cutting large blocks from the rock mass, moving them to the processing site, and then loading them. To separate large blocks from the rock, methods were often used that seemed primitive, but were very effective. Wooden wedges were driven into pre-drilled or hollowed-out recesses, which were then doused with water. The wood swelled, creating enormous pressure and gradually breaking off huge pieces of rock. Sometimes a method of fire splitting was used. A large fire was lit on the surface of the rock, and then the hot stone was rapidly cooled with water, causing thermal cracks and facilitating the separation of the blocks. Once the stone was broken off and, if necessary, hewn to the desired shape, it was moved to the construction site using wooden levers, rollers, and human strength, and sometimes oxen or horses. Each castle required thousands, and sometimes tens of thousands, of cubic meters of stone. The largest stones could weigh several tons, and moving them was a real engineering challenge. Temporary roads and gentle ramps had to be built, and complex systems of blocks and ropes, as well as special wooden carts, had to be used. Sometimes it took more effort and time to transport the stone than to extract it. Imagine the scene: a string of ox-drawn carts slowly creeping along muddy roads, carrying giant stone blocks, each of which could become part of an impregnable wall. It was a truly colossal logistical task, dependent on weather conditions, the quality of the roads, and the availability of draft animals. How do you think such heavy and dangerous work in the quarries affected the life expectancy and health of medieval workers? And why, despite all the risks, did people take on such work? What would happen when the rainy season turned the roads into an impassable mess and thousands of tons of stone were waiting to be delivered? Stay tuned, the most interesting part is yet to come. In addition to hiring free laborers, the construction of some royal or large feudal castles in England relied on the practice of castle work summons, a special form of feudal duty that was much harsher and less well-known than the usual corvée. This was not simply a requirement to work in the Lord's fields for a few days a year. The castle work summons obliged entire communities, towns, and even counties to supply not only raw materials, but also skilled workers, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, for the construction of a castle for a long period, often months or even years. Ignoring such a call entails severe penalties, including confiscation of property and even imprisonment. What made this particularly unique and problematic was the principle of guild quotas. Each guild of craftsmen in a particular city or region was obliged to supply a certain number of craftsmen to royal or feudal construction projects. For example, London bricklayers or carpenters could be called upon to work on a castle in Wales or northern England, far from their homes and families for an indefinite period. They might be paid a token wage, but this was often well below the market rate, and the working conditions themselves were extremely harsh and dangerous. This led to labor shortages in their hometowns, rising prices for services, and even the decline of local crafts. There are documented cases of mass desertion by craftsmen who refused to obey such calls. For example, in the 13th century, during the construction of a number of Welsh castles by Edward III, there were numerous complaints of evasion of royal service and even special decrees for the capture of fugitives. The king was forced to issue pardons for those who returned in order to somehow make up for the shortage of manpower. This practice, although an effective tool for concentrating resources, also undermined the loyalty of the population and caused deep discontent. Unlike ordinary corvée labor, the castle levy could be imposed at any time of the year, regardless of the agricultural cycle, which caused enormous damage to the economy of the communities. This was a temporary but powerful state intervention that placed the interests of the monarch or a large feudal lord above the welfare of entire regions, demonstrating how important castles were for maintaining power and at what cost they were built, and how they divided the last food between the elderly and children. This was a temporary but powerful state intervention that placed the interests of the monarch or a large feudal lord above the welfare of entire regions, demonstrating how important castles were for maintaining power and at what cost they were built. The construction of a large stone castle was a project of colossal proportions, requiring not just a group of workers, but a veritable army of builders, numbering hundreds and sometimes thousands, each with their own specific role and hierarchy. At the top of this pyramid stood the lord or king who financed the project, allocated land, and made strategic decisions about the size, shape, and location of the castle. His administrators or stewards were responsible for supplies, logistics, recruiting labor, and paying wages. The master mason was in charge of the day-to-day stuff. This was not just a worker, but in fact the chief engineer, architect, foreman, and sometimes even the artist all rolled into one. He designed the castle, drew up detailed plans, often on parchment or simply on the ground to scale, supervised all work on the construction site, and was responsible for the quality of the masonry, deadlines, and even safety. His knowledge was invaluable, and he could earn a very impressive salary, sometimes comparable to the income of a minor knight, and his name was often recorded in the chronicles. Under him worked apprentices and stonecutters, masons, who were the main skilled workers. They cut the stones, shaping them into the required form and size using chisels, hammers, and picks. Their work required not only physical strength and endurance, but also high precision, spatial thinking, and a deep understanding of the properties of stone, its layers and cracks. Many of them were traveling craftsmen, moving from one large construction site to another. Carpenters played an equally important role. They erected complex wooden scaffolding, which was absolutely necessary for working at height, and built temporary cranes and lifting mechanisms. They also made wooden frames for roofs, floorboards, massive gates and doors, window frames, as well as temporary templates and formwork for arches and vaults. Without their skills, the construction of high walls and towers would have been simply impossible. Blacksmiths were indispensable. They forged all the necessary metal tools, chisels, hammers, pickaxes, as well as door hinges, bolts, chains for lifting mechanisms, nails, and other metal parts, keeping the entire construction site operational. Laborers made up the largest group, sometimes accounting for 80–90% of the entire workforce. They were simple peasants, often hired for a pittance or even forced to work as part of feudal duties, such as corvée. Their work was the hardest, most monotonous, and dangerous. They carried stones from quarries and delivered them to the construction site, carried water and sand, mixed tons of mortar, dug huge ditches, and built earthen ramparts and fortifications. Their labor was the foundation of everything, but it was paid very little. Their work was the most dangerous, and the mortality rate on such construction sites due to accidents, falls, and diseases was extremely high. In addition to them, there were always carters with oxen and horses delivering materials, as well as women and children who could help with less heavy work, such as collecting water, cooking for the workers, or supplying small stones. The hierarchy on the construction site was strict. Discipline was maintained with an iron fist, and the working day lasted from dawn to dusk. Sometimes the workers even lived right on the site of the castle under construction in temporary barracks or tents so as not to waste time traveling, which created entire temporary settlements. How difficult do you think it was to coordinate such a huge and diverse group of people, sometimes unable to speak a common language and coming from different places, to build such monumental structures? And how did they maintain motivation and order during decades of construction? The answer to this question is much more interesting than it seems. Stay tuned. Medieval castles are usually perceived as visual symbols of power and inaccessibility. Massive walls, battlements, crenellations, moats. But behind this facade lay little-known engineering solutions based not only on visual, but also on acoustic control of space, especially in isolated, hard-to-reach regions where the threat of sudden attack was constant. Architects sought ways to hear the enemy before he could be seen. In these conditions, primitive but highly sophisticated audio technologies emerged. One of the most unusual solutions was the so-called singing stones, special resonating cavities built into the structure of the castle. These could be voids inside the masonry, hidden niches in the walls, or carefully calculated ventilation channels. Their purpose was not simply to amplify sound, but to create acoustic signals warning of movement, weather changes, or even the approach of strangers. In some cases, these sounds were so unusual that they caused superstitious fear among people. For example, in one of the towers of a castle in North Yorkshire, built at the end of the 12th century, archaeologists discovered a network of strange channels laid in the masonry. In strong winds, they created a characteristic humming or even hissing sound, which the inhabitants perceived as the voice of the wall. Legends spoke of ancestors warning their descendants of danger, but it is more logical to assume that these effects were the result of deliberate engineering. Perhaps the garrison used this method to improve internal discipline, as the alarming sounds could not be ignored, even at night. Nor could an enemy sneaking up in the dark. But architectural acoustics were not limited to resonance. Some castles included so-called listening shafts in their layout, narrow camouflage galleries leading to inner courtyards or to the base of the outer walls. Their main purpose was to intercept sounds, both from potential tunnels and from enemy conversations. Only a child or a very thin adult could crawl through the particularly narrow shafts, which allowed eavesdroppers to be sent there without risk of loss. Sometimes they ended in special chambers with enhanced acoustics, a kind of sound collector. One letter from the 13th century describes fortifications built after the suppression of another uprising, mentioning passages leading to the ears. This most likely refers to these acoustic galleries. There are known cases where such shafts were used not only for eavesdropping, but also for suddenly releasing smoke, hot steam, or even oil to catch the enemy off guard while they were digging. This was not just a passive element, but a multifunctional defense tool. The construction of such systems required a deep understanding of acoustics, which makes them even more remarkable for their time. After all, this happened long before the emergence of scientific acoustics as a discipline. In most cases, singing stones and auditory shafts disappeared with the rise of artillery and changes in military architecture, but their traces remain in material remains and folklore. And if you listen carefully, perhaps walls really can tell us more than meets the eye. Much is known about medieval mortar recipes, but not everything. Little attention has been paid to the little-studied practice of adding organic components, which significantly expanded the functionality of the familiar lime mixture. These additives were passed down by word of mouth within guilds, kept strictly secret, and varied from region to region. We are not just talking about the strength of the masonry, but its ability to withstand water, fire, and time. The basic composition included lime, sand, and water. But to achieve the desired properties, craftsmen used materials that at first glance seem strange. One of them was bone meal, crushed animal bones rich in phosphates. When added to the mortar, it reacted with the lime, strengthening the structure and increasing its density. The mortar became less susceptible to erosion and lasted much longer, especially in high humidity conditions. Another important component was whey. It contained casein, a natural protein that acted as a natural glue. Whey not only improved adhesion, allowing the solution to bond better with the stones, but also made it more malleable. At the same time, it gave the finished masonry hydrophobic properties. Water penetrated less easily, which is especially valuable in northern regions with heavy rainfall. But the most unusual and underrated additive was animal wool. Sheep or goat wool was most often used, which was finely chopped and mixed into the still wet solution. At first glance, this seemed like a pointless gesture, but the wool served a very important function. First, it prevented microcracks from forming during rapid drying, especially in the summer months. The fibers absorbed some of the internal stress, preserving the integrity of the masonry. Secondly, and more importantly, The wool significantly increased the fire resistance of the structure. During a fire, the fibers did not ignite with the flames, but slowly charred, creating microvoids in the structure of the mortar. These voids allowed the steam formed by the heating of the masonry to escape freely, preventing explosive destruction from excess pressure. The effect was similar to how reinforcing fibers work today in fiber-reinforced concrete, a material of the 21st century. The addition of wool was particularly common in regions where livestock farming was well developed, such as in northern and western England. It was there that castles were more often targeted by arsonists, and the fire resistance of the mortar played an important role. Moreover, wool was cheap, unlike metal additives or resins. This made the technology accessible even to less affluent construction projects. There is little documentary evidence of this practice. Mortar recipes were kept as professional secrets. However, laboratory analysis of masonry fragments from ancient castles sometimes reveals microscopic traces of charred fibers. This confirms historians' conjectures and highlights the level of knowledge possessed by the craftsmen. They did not simply lay stones. They created engineering solutions that were ahead of their time. These forgotten technologies clearly demonstrate how finely medieval builders understood their materials. Without any science, but with deep experience and observation, they achieved what even modern engineers sometimes fail to achieve: uncompromising durability. The heyday of majestic stone castles, symbols of feudal power, engineering genius, and military might, came to a logical end with the advent of a new destructive factor: artillery. With the invention of gunpowder in Europe and the subsequent creation of the first primitive cannons in the 14th or 15th centuries, a real revolution in the siege warfare began. What had seemed impregnable for centuries suddenly became vulnerable, and that changed everything. The first artillery pieces, bombards, were clumsy, heavy, required a whole team to transport, and were inaccurate. However, even with all these limitations, they demonstrated one important thing. Traditional medieval castles, despite their imposing appearance, were not designed to withstand such force. The tall and relatively thin walls that had withstood catapults, ballistas, and battering rams for centuries now cracked and collapsed under the weight of iron projectiles fired from cannons. A single hit could destroy an entire tower or create a breach through which the enemy could easily break in. Architects and military engineers did not stand idly by. They tried to adapt old methods to the new reality. Walls began to be built thicker, lower, and with less slope to dissipate the kinetic energy of projectiles. Towers gave way to massive, rounded bastions, which were better at dissipating shock waves. Some castles were additionally reinforced with earthen ramparts and moats to make it difficult for artillery to get close. But this was only a temporary measure. Artillery developed rapidly. By the 15th century, cannons had become lighter, more mobile, more powerful, and more accurate. Their ammunition also evolved. Iron balls replaced stone ones, and with the advent of shrapnel and incendiary shells, defense became much more complicated. By the 16th century, it had become clear that classic medieval fortifications were hopelessly outdated. Even the strongest and most technologically advanced castles could not hold out for long against an organized artillery siege. The strategy of warfare underwent radical changes. Sieges, once the basis of feudal warfare, became rare and ineffective. They were replaced by rapid military campaigns using firepower, where speed and maneuverability became more important than extensive defenses. Instead of castles, bastion fortresses began to appear, a new form of fortification architecture that came from Italy. These fortresses had low, thick earthen walls, often faced with brick, and polygonal bastions designed for effective circular defense and repelling artillery fire. Their purpose was not to impress visually, but to withstand a barrage of fire. This was the dawn of a new era in military construction, an era in which engineering was completely subordinated to ballistics. Meanwhile, the fate of the old castles was decided in different ways. Some were destroyed to the ground during sieges, others were abandoned as useless. Others were partially rebuilt or converted into residences for the nobility, losing their defensive functions but retaining their architectural form. Sometimes the remains of fortifications were simply built into the new urban space, becoming part of walls or warehouses. The decline of castles is not a date on the calendar, but a long, gradual process caused not only by technological progress, but also by a change in the very thinking about war, security, and power. Cannons changed not only architecture, but also the balance of power in Europe. The world was entering a new era of fortification, less romantic but much more pragmatic. The construction of English medieval castles is not just a history of building, but a fascinating saga of human ingenuity, perseverance, and ability to adapt to the challenges of the times. From primitive Motte and Bailey structures to majestic stone citadels, each stage of their evolution was a response to changing threats and developing technologies. It was a world where the choice of stone could determine the fate of a fortress, where thousands of workers labored in incredibly harsh conditions, and master stonemasons were true geniuses of their time. Their engineering solutions, logistical challenges, and even superstitions influencing site selection shaped the appearance of these grandiose structures. Castles were not only military machines, but also powerful symbols of power, prestige, and centers of life that eventually gave way to new technologies. What do you think about this incredible chapter in the history of human construction? What other aspects of medieval engineering or everyday life would you like to see explored in our next episodes? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more exciting stories.